Ninelle Xavier had long attracted attention, as she belonged to a family whose roots ran deep in the history of Canaimella. Once, she was just an unremarkable young woman, introduced by the elderly Mr. Xavier to his acquaintances 3 years ago. Since then, her status had grown, and with it, her responsibilities, which tested her character's resilience. Always by her side was the family werewolf, Prue. His presence was a reminder of the powerful secrets hidden behind the old mansion's walls. In public, Prue was provocative. Standing barely over 5 feet tall, he radiated raw strength. His frame was compact and muscular, his hair jet black and coarse. Over the years of service, Prue had developed an uncanny, almost supernatural sharpness. Ninelle never thought much of it. After all, the werewolf had been created using magic passed down through the Xavier family. The essence of his existence was a blood debt, to protect his master under any circumstance, even if it drove his mind to the brink of collapse. Recently, rumors swirled through the city that Ninelle no longer wished to keep Prue. Tales of his outbursts were multiplying, the most notorious involving an incident on a bus. Prue had refused to pay the fare, believing the city owed him a debt. In his view, years of service to the family entitled him to ignore trivial formalities. The bus driver, however, stood firm, demanding he follow the rules. Prue, enraged, brandished his weapon, turning the vehicle into a battleground. The Xavier family security team intervened at great cost. They had to gift the city a brand new bus to cover up the fiasco. The previous bus was left riddled with bullet holes and bloodstains. Its remains a terrifying sight. No formal charges were brought by city officials due to an unspoken agreement between the elite of Canaimella and the Xavier family. Still, such events tarnished the reputation of the house now managed by Ninelle. Though she was not a blood relative of the previous generations, after her marriage and the birth of her child, she became the rightful mistress. The family traditions of the Xaviers were unfamiliar to her, but she understood that casting Prue out or simply killing him was not an option. Magical bonds tied the werewolf to Ninelle's late husband, and breaking them without consequence was impossible. The servants remained silent, and the young mistress herself had to seek a solution. She watched as Prue became increasingly agitated, his demeanor more volatile. The cause was clear. The werewolf's mind was struggling to break free from the confines of his years-long servitude. The growing fear in the air suggested that one night he might do something irreparable. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Ninelle could not publicly denounce Prue as an enemy. In the Xavier family, everything was handled discreetly, without fanfare. Those familiar with the clan's traditions suspected that the young mistress needed an outsider to handle the situation. Prue was no ordinary werewolf. Created through magic, he possessed unique abilities that allowed him to maintain his human form for extended periods, while selectively harnessing his lupine nature. Ordinary assassins would likely falter. What was needed was a specialist, someone versed in family curses and ancient magic capable of prolonging a creature's life many times over. At this juncture, many locals recalled a man named Frank Hayden, often referred to simply as Fra. He had returned to Canaimella a couple of years ago after a long absence, during which he had studied various magical disciplines and other esoteric paths. Frank was born in the city but had left in his youth, deeming it too small for his thirst for knowledge. He traveled extensively, seeking ways to influence the world through secret rites. Upon his return, Hayden settled in an apartment near the city center and acted as if he were destined for a significant role in the local power structure. Rumors swirled about his multiple marriages, though no one ever heard of any children. Speculation held that his spouses were merely temporary companions, though no one could confirm this. Hayden shared no details, and his demeanor made it clear he had no time for idle confessions. Mentioning Frank Hayden often elicited raised eyebrows. Many considered him cynical and indifferent, but they respected his rare combination of knowledge and strength. It was said he could instill fear with a single look while remaining impeccably polite. Hayden needed a challenge worthy of his skills, and the task of eliminating the Xavier family werewolf, especially through a veiled, indirect commission, seemed to align perfectly with his ambitions. The Xavier family would inevitably owe a substantial debt to whoever managed to stop the rampaging creature, dangerous not only to Canamela but also to its young mistress. Many believed that killing Prue would be no small feat. It wasn't just the werewolf's physical strength, but also the potential consequences. If the werewolf were destroyed improperly, the magic might backfire. But if done correctly, not only could lives be saved, but there could also be a profit to gain. Part of the creature's magical essence lingered in its remains, a fact whispered among the initiated. Such matters intrigued Frank Hayden more than anything else. He had a knack for finding opportunities where others saw only danger. He also recognized that the Xavier family now needed external support. Ninelle could undoubtedly have an honest conversation with him, but she avoided direct dealings, unwilling to publicly seek help. Instead, she sent a subtle message. Whoever resolved the problem could expect a significant reward. Soon, word spread that Hayden had accepted the challenge. Allegedly, he obtained several samples of Prue's blood to analyze the werewolf's creation. It was said that he discerned an unfamiliar, almost alien pattern in those drops. No one saw Fra openly approach Lady Xavier, but everyone sensed that the game was afoot. No one knew how long it would take for Hayden to calculate or track his target, but the townspeople began glancing over their shoulders as if expecting a storm to break. Among the rumors, servants at the Xavier mansion grew increasingly uneasy. They noticed how Prue started leaving the house without warning. He often drove his old car, sometimes accompanied by a young assistant, sometimes not. Occasionally, these assistants would recount tales the next morning of near catastrophes caused by the werewolf's whims. Ninelle tried to maintain her composure, but her eyes betrayed her tension. Thus passed the weeks leading up to the decisive turn of events. Ninelle Xavier usually woke early to oversee estate matters, converse with the servants, and meet visitors bringing minor requests. Lately, however, she spent her mornings in deep contemplation. Now that Prue was completely out of control, she had to take decisive action. Yet no one had taught her how to handle an enchanted werewolf. The late Mr. Xavier had left her a vast inheritance, but it did not include detailed instructions for dealing with a family servant who had lost his grip on sanity. The situation had escalated, and Ninelle understood that any hesitation was fraught with peril. She remembered Frank Hayden's existence. Or rather, she remembered him not so much personally as through the stories of others. She'd never had the chance to meet him during her husband's lifetime because the old master had avoided unpredictable individuals. However, Hayden's name often surfaced whenever dark practices and obscure knowledge were mentioned, things most of the city's elite preferred not to meddle with. It was said that Hayden had mastery over rituals others had only read about in dubious manuscripts. No one could say for certain what kind of man he was or what sort of company he favored, but in dealing with Prue, Hayden seemed like a promising ally. Ninelle suspected that without his help, her task would be nearly impossible. The mansion was steeped in tension. The servants sensed that their mistress was searching for a solution, but shared no details. guards tasked with tracking Prue returned empty-handed. They knew that an encounter with him could spell serious trouble and were reluctant to confront him head-on, fearing the werewolf might unleash chaos. Prue's sense of duty might still compel him to protect his mistress, but his actions were erratic. He disappeared for long stretches, and when he was spotted, it was often in places so dangerous even the police avoided them unless in pairs. Rumors swirled that Prue roamed the old factory districts and alleys near the manufactories, places where one could vanish easily, and danger loomed from every corner. At times, Ninel wrestled with guilt. She wasn't a blood heir of the family, but had embraced its traditions. And those traditions dictated that the family's werewolf could not simply be abandoned. Such an act would be seen as betrayal, and the Xavier family's reputation was built on honoring their promises without fail. Prue had sworn to protect the family, and it made sense that he would struggle to understand his new mistress, who wasn't bound to him by blood. To him she was an outsider, a temporary figure occupying the throne of his late master. Perhaps it was this dynamic that sparked new motives in Prue, pushing him toward increasingly dangerous behavior. Ninel needed someone who could untangle such magic without harming the family in the process. While Ninel contemplated her strategy, fate intervened. One evening, a man named Minos came to visit, a small-time trader with a knack for navigating the city's rumors. He spoke to her about food supplies, listed risks, and proposed new contracts before suddenly lowering his voice to mention Hayden's name. Ninel listened closely. Minos hinted that Hayden had already taken an interest in the werewolf situation and was seeking samples related to Prue. Word of a commission had circulated within a select group, and many believed Hayden was the one who could resolve the issue. Minos offered to connect her with the specialist if she wished. Ninel refrained from asking what kind of services Hayden provided in the city, but instructed Minos to arrange a meeting. With that, their conversation ended. The trader bowed and left. The next day, a servant brought Ninel a note from an anonymous sender. It contained the time and location where she could meet someone with the necessary expertise. The meeting was to take place in a quiet cafe near the outskirts, at the base of a hill crowned by a sprawling park. The note bore no name, but the handwriting was neat and slightly old-fashioned, as though the writer adhered to traditional formalities. Ninel surmised that this must be Hayden's doing. She ordered a car prepared and went alone, leaving her security behind at the mansion. It was part of the terms, and she saw no reason to attract undue attention. At the cafe, she noticed a man seated in a far corner beneath a wall clock. His appearance was austere. His face, though inscrutable, lacked any hint of malice. Perhaps this was the man known as Hayden, though Ninel didn't ask outright. She approached his table, took a seat across from him, and silently waited for him to speak. He wasted no time, immediately inquiring about her grievances with the werewolf and what outcome she sought. Ninel explained the problem. Prue had destabilized the city's peace, and she needed him stopped, permanently. At the same time, she emphasized her desire to avoid a public scandal that could jeopardize the family's traditions. She made it clear that she was willing to pay generously for a solution. The man listened attentively, nodding without unnecessary interruptions. He promised to send instructions by evening. Ninel rose and left, maintaining an air of composure. She knew this was Frank Hayden. She had glimpsed him years ago at one of the old master's receptions, but hadn't paid him much attention at the time. Now, she fully grasped who she was dealing with. The rumors were true. He carried himself with the confidence of someone unafraid to take on the riskiest tasks. Back at the mansion, Ninel immersed herself in estate management paperwork, though her thoughts kept returning to the impending collaboration with Hayden. She reflected on the need for secrecy. Rumors were inevitable, but if she could conceal her direct involvement, the family's reputation would remain intact. The pressing question was what would happen after Prue's elimination. The Xavier family would owe Hayden a debt. Would Ninelle be able to maintain control over the household with such a powerful creditor looming? When evening came, a letter arrived at the mansion. It outlined the need to provide Hayden with an item or object bearing traces of the werewolf. This could be clothing, claw marks, or dried blood. Hayden required a sample to perform a ritual that would track the creature and determine the best approach to deal with him. Ninelle ordered the servants to search Prue's quarters. It didn't take long to find something. An old jacket of his hung in the back of a closet, its lining stained with dark, rust-colored marks. The sample was carefully packed and discreetly handed off to a man waiting at the back gate. He assured them it would reach Hayden. Ninelle anticipated that she would soon learn how the operation would proceed. Meanwhile, the servants reported that Prue still hadn't returned. Some claimed to have heard dogs howling in the park at night, but no one could confirm that it was him. Ninelle prepared herself for whatever might come next. Late that evening, she sat in her study, illuminated by the dim glow of a single lamp. A stack of documents lay untouched before her. It felt as though the entire mansion was holding its breath. The corridor clock ticked away the seconds, but time seemed to stretch endlessly. Ninelle's mind wandered to Prue's last argument with the chauffeur, when the werewolf had stormed into the house and declared that he had the right to do as he pleased, because he no longer received clear orders from his late master. That was the first time Ninelle had felt fear. She steeled herself, knowing that resilience was the only way to honor the old master's trust. But now, as the situation spiraled out of control, she had no choice but to rely on an external force. One that could take the burden of decision from her shoulders without shattering the fragile foundation on which the family stood. Morning found Ninelle still at her desk. She hadn't slept through the night, unable to shake her anxiety. Late the previous evening, she had received a letter from Frank Hayden containing precise instructions for preparations. A room in the mansion's northern wing, long abandoned, was to be cleared. Old furniture needed to be removed, tapestries taken down from the walls, and the floor made accessible for the use of specific symbols. Ninelle ordered the servants to follow the instructions exactly. Though reluctant, they set about the task, careful not to ask questions. No one knew the purpose of these measures, but all understood they concerned Prue's fate. Another condition required the retrieval of a particular chest from the family vault, locked with 3 keys. Records indicated that the chest contained items used in the creation of the family's werewolf. Ninelle had never seen its contents, as previous generations had forbidden access. But now, the locks had to be opened. Only then could Hayden gain access to the family's hidden secrets. Ninelle supervised the process cautiously, aware of the potential significance of any object inside. When the servants lifted the lid, they uncovered a bundle wrapped in fabric that carried the scent of time itself. Ninelle immediately guessed that this was what the mage required to influence Prue's essence. She carefully took the bundle and handed it to a trusted servant, instructing him to deliver it to the northern wing without delay. The room was now prepared. Tables draped with clean cloth stood ready for the artifacts to be arranged. The space was bare, with only stone walls and a sturdy wooden floor. Ninelle understood that prying eyes were to be avoided at all costs. She stationed guards at the entrance to the corridor, instructing them to admit only vetted individuals. Briefly, she explained that no one was to ask questions or speak of the work being done under her supervision. The servants, though sullen, obeyed without protest. Ninel decided to wait for Hayden's arrival in her study. She alternated between opening documents and casting them aside, unable to focus on her duties. Finally, a servant appeared to announce that Hayden had arrived. Ninel walked to the hall and saw a man in dark clothing holding a small bag. He stood with a steady air, upright and showing no sign of impatience. Ninel led him to the staircase that descended into the northern wing. Hayden surveyed the spacious rooms, examined the chest and its contents, and requested to be left alone with the items. He specified that he would need several hours of uninterrupted quiet to focus. Ninel nodded, handed him the keys to the adjoining doors, and instructed everyone not to disturb the mage. She then withdrew. In the silence that followed, Hayden methodically laid out his tools on the tables. Intricately carved knives, a jar of dark liquid, a bundle of slender rods, and a fine brush. He unwrapped the bundle taken from the chest to reveal a coil of jet-black hair, matted under a layer of ancient wax. Hayden quietly set the jar beside it and prepared for his work. Passing his hand over the hair, he seemed to sense residual traces of magical energy. Then, selecting one of the knives, he carefully sliced off a small fragment and dropped it into the jar. The liquid rippled slightly. Taking the brush, he began to paint lines onto the cleared floor using the mixture. The smell was pungent, the process painstaking and deliberate. Elsewhere in the mansion, Ninel sat in the drawing room, attempting to calm her nerves. The servants whispered in the hallways, bewildered by what was happening in the northern wing. The guards remained silent but visibly tense. As night fell, Ninel noticed a servant running down the corridor with a bundle of spare candles. Extra light was evidently required. She didn't stop him, assuming Hayden had asked for them. Hours passed without word of Prue, though reports of his antics had been a near-daily occurrence before. Ninel surmised that the werewolf might be keeping to the shadows, aware that a threat was looming. Finally, the awaited moment came. A servant knocked softly on her door, informing her that Hayden had summoned her to the northern wing. Ninel rose without hesitation, walking briskly to the room. Upon entering, she was met with the heavy smell of the mixture on the floor. Hayden stood near the center of an intricate design, examining it under the light of several lamps. The walls were bare, the stone floor now adorned with patterns composed of intricate symbols. Turning to Ninel, Hayden explained that the ritual required a final step: her presence. He gestured toward a small makeshift altar fashioned from an overturned crate and told her she needed to offer her blood as a binding agent. Ninel flinched but understood there was no turning back. She glanced at Hayden, then approached the crate, picking up the knife he had prepared. Carefully, she made a shallow cut on her palm, waiting until a drop of blood welled to the surface. She let it fall onto the symbol at the center of the pattern. Hayden watched intently as the drop mingled with the drying liquid. He then began to recite words from an aged piece of parchment pulled from his bag. The incantation sounded fragmented, as though he were wrestling with unfamiliar sounds. Ninel stood still, her hand hovering over the symbol. Soon, the lamps flickered, the mixture on the floor began to sizzle, and the smell intensified. The ritual had begun. The process took nearly an hour. During that time, the pattern on the floor underwent several transformations. At first, the lines were faint, then they brightened, only to darken later. Ninel felt a chill in the room. Hayden placed the parchment back into his bag and informed her that the ritual would pinpoint Prue's location if he remained within Cainamela's borders. However, it would take time. Ninel silently watched the shimmering pattern. Hayden cautioned that locating Prue was only the beginning. A specialized method would still be required to destroy him. Ninel understood there was nothing more to be done for now. She instructed the servants to remain vigilant. Hayden urged her to rest, as the hardest part of the hunt was yet to come. Ninel knew that events were now in motion. The morning light filtered weakly through heavy curtains as Ninel returned to the northern wing to check on the results of the ritual. The smell of dried mixture still hung in the air, and the walls seemed steeped in an echoing silence. The lines on the stone floor had faded slightly, but remained sharply defined overall. Hayden was gone, and no servants were in sight. Ninel assumed the mage had left for the city to conduct final calculations and determine Prue's exact location. Ninel refrained from demanding detailed reports. She understood that in matters like this, the best approach was to grant the executor freedom of action, so long as they fulfilled their end of the bargain. The servants continued to avoid the northern halls, listening intently for any unusual noises, but not daring to enter without explicit permission. She instructed them to maintain the household's routine and act as though nothing unusual was happening. Internally, however, she felt the mounting pressure of the next step, one that would demand a firm resolve. The remainder of her morning was spent in discussions with members of the city council, who sought reassurance that Prue's incidents would not recur. They were unaware of the covert hunt, but suspected that the Xavier family rarely left matters unresolved. Ninel worked to placate them, offering promises of compensation should further issues arise. She spoke of restoring the family's reputation and ensuring that the city could continue to rely on lucrative contracts. Her words flowed on autopilot, her head nodding and her face holding a practiced, neutral smile. Her thoughts, however, were consumed by the ritual, the lurking werewolf somewhere within Canamela, and the enigmatic mage who could summon her for further collaboration at any moment. When she returned home, she was informed that Hayden had sent a messenger to summon her. The messenger conveyed the location revealed by the ritual's findings, an old industrial zone abandoned decades ago. Though far removed, it technically fell within the city's limits, making it an ideal hiding spot for the werewolf. Ninel had never been there herself, but had heard of crumbling warehouses and half-destroyed workshops that once teemed with factory life. Now the area was frequented only by the homeless, and occasionally small-time gangs evading the city's police. Hayden's servant explained that the mage required Ninel's brief presence to complete the ritual on site. Though hesitant, Ninel decided not to delay. She ordered a car, took 2 guards with her, instructed them to stay at a distance and not interfere, and set off for the location Hayden had indicated. When they reached the outskirts of Canamela, Ninel was met with gray walls, fences, and desolate warehouses. There were no signs or markings to indicate ownership of the territory. In the distance, a lone smokestack stood with its top crumbled away. The air felt unnervingly still, as if detached from the city's usual bustle. The car stopped on a concrete lot, and Ninel walked a short distance, following the directions she'd been given. She soon saw Hayden standing by a set of torn-down gates, surrounded by debris and rust-stained slabs. He gestured for her to enter the structure, cautioning her to speak softly. Ninel didn't argue and simply nodded. Inside, the air was heavy with the staleness of old machinery and decayed materials. Hayden pointed toward a dark alcove, which appeared to lead to an underground passage. Perhaps it had once been a coal reserve or a storage area for factory tools. Hayden explained that the ritual had pinpointed this exact location, and he could sense disturbances indicating the presence of a powerful werewolf. Ninel noted the mage's intense focus as he stared into the empty space, as though trying to see what lay beyond the visible. She shivered but said nothing. Hayden informed her that capturing Prue would require a special bait. He mentioned that the bait must include a drop of Ninel's blood, as she was the family's formal head and retained a connection to the werewolf servant. Ninel gave a slight nod, acknowledging the logic behind the request. When Hayden produced a small vial of dark liquid and offered her a knife, she pressed her lips together firmly. A small cut on her forearm and a single drop slipping into the vial. It took only seconds. Hayden thanked her, sealed the vial tightly, and declared that they now had everything needed to set the trap. Ninel wanted to ask how long they would have to wait, but Hayden explained that the ritual's completion required the cover of night. According to him, the werewolf, exhausted from being hunted and deprived of rest, would almost certainly be drawn to this spot eventually. The site held traces of magical transformations that linked Prue to his late master. Hayden assured her that Prue would feel the pull, navigate through the underground corridors, and emerge directly into the spell waiting for him at its center. The mage avoided going into specifics, but hinted that this would be no ordinary ambush. He directed his assistants to mark the walls with symbols similar to those he had drawn in the Xavier mansion, though now they were concealed under layers of dust and clutter. Ninel listened to his instructions, a growing sense of unease stirring within her as she realized how critical the upcoming moments would be. She sent her guards to patrol the perimeter, knowing full well that they could offer little help in a direct confrontation with the werewolf. Their role was merely to keep any bystanders from wandering near the ritual site. Hayden, meanwhile, continued his preparations. He ordered his assistants to move heavy sheets of rusted metal, covering certain sections of the floor to conceal protective symbols beneath. According to him, these measures would counter any resistance from Prue and confine him to a specific area when the final stage of the trap was sprung. Occasionally, Hayden would pause, seemingly straining to hear something deep within the warehouses. Ninel stood aside, watching as the tense atmosphere grew heavier with each passing step, bringing her closer to an irreversible outcome. Twilight soon gave way to darkness. The glow of city lights barely reached the abandoned area, leaving the decrepit buildings cloaked in thick shadows. No one else appeared, and the guards remained at their posts. Ninel's gaze was drawn to the empty windows of the upper floors. Hayden instructed her to stay on a small elevated platform near the wall, where she would be relatively safe. He pointed out a spot for a light source, positioned to illuminate the proceedings without disrupting the ritual. Ninel disliked such compromises, but trusted Hayden's expertise. All she could do now was wait. Hayden and his assistants placed the final symbols, double-checked the markings, and ensured the vial containing Ninel's blood was at hand. The liquid inside had already been mixed with other reagents, forming a thin, glimmering substance. As midnight approached, the wind occasionally stirred, sending flecks of dust drifting down from the shattered windows above. The faint rustling of the dust seemed to amplify every small movement. Ninel kept her eyes fixed on the dark space near the underground passage. By now, all extraneous lights had been extinguished, save for a single lantern shielded by a protective cover. Its faint glow highlighted the mound of metal where Hayden's symbols intertwined. The silence was broken only by the occasional muffled footsteps, the distant drip of water, and the crinkle of a bag someone had set aside. Everything in the air warned that at any moment, something capable of shattering the fragile balance between a carefully laid trap and a bloody confrontation could appear. Ninel watched Hayden's silhouette as he stood near the passageway. She reflected on how much depended on their success. The future of the Xavier family, her own safety, and even the fate of the mage who had taken on this perilous task. Perhaps the entire city would breathe easier if this uncontrollable force vanished from its shadows. Ninel felt a growing tension, as if her entire being was preparing for the explosion of events. Her pulse slowed, her thoughts sharpened, and her sense of time faded. Fragments of memories flashed through her mind. Her wedding day, the birth of her child, the look in the old master's eyes when he introduced her as the new mistress, and the ever-lurking figure of the werewolf shrouded in twilight. Everything now seemed to converge toward an inevitable resolution. The night in the industrial zone had reached the point where the human eye could no longer distinguish the contours of concrete slabs and rusted structures. A damp silence hung over the area, a ghostly reminder of the long-buried industrial era. Ninel stood by the wall, observing Hayden and his assistants as they worked. She saw them reinforce metal sheets, pour a thick mixture into floor cracks, and set up a small, barely visible table near the passage, where tools resembling surgical knives lay neatly arranged. The Xavier family's guards stood at a respectful distance, prepared only to sound an alarm or intercept intruders if needed. Their faces remained stoic, but each one knew that conventional methods were useless here. One of Hayden's assistants muttered that Prue moved almost soundlessly, and anyone attempting to stop the werewolf risked not returning by morning. Ninel couldn't help but overhear, her heart beating slightly faster. She knew she couldn't show fear. Everything hinged on her resolve. Hayden finished drawing the final patterns on the floor and stepped back to examine his work. He checked that every line was sharp and unbroken. Then he gestured for Ninel to approach, pointing to the small vial of her blood she had given him earlier. He uncorked it, inserted a slender silver pipette, and carefully extracted a small amount of the liquid. With precision, he sprinkled the bait onto the center of the magical symbol. Under the light of the nearby lantern, the droplet shimmered on the rusted metal slab, emitting a suffocating odor. Hayden instructed Ninel to step back immediately, ensuring she stayed out of the enchantment's range. She obeyed, moving several paces away, feeling a sharp click inside her, an awareness that retreat was no longer an option. The remaining blood was mixed with a translucent substance in a separate vessel. Ninel had no idea what Hayden had added, but she watched as the coagulated liquid hissed and dissolved, turning darker. The mage sealed the vessel tightly and placed it in his chest pocket. His expression betrayed no fear, yet his pursed lips and focused gaze hinted at the tension he was suppressing. He waited as his assistants erected 3 tall posts around the area, metal rods engraved with unfamiliar symbols. Once they were in place, Hayden nodded toward a man stationed at the underground entrance. The assistant knelt, pulled an old bell from his pocket, and rang it once with great care. Ninel barely caught the faint chime. She thought she felt a chill in the air, though the wind hadn't picked up. The industrial zone seemed even more desolate and dark, as if the space itself recoiled from the alien ritual unfolding within it. Hayden approached the auxiliary table and laid out a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine. He lit them with a match, filling the air with a sharp, bitter aroma. The small flame flickered, briefly illuminating the edges of dusty, metal-covered surfaces. The entire scene felt like the assembly of a meticulously crafted mechanism where every detail served a specific purpose. Midnight drew near, and a strange stillness settled over the abandoned zone, as though time itself had slowed. Faint echoes emanated from the walls and corners, resembling the distant hum of old fans or engines stirring to life. Hayden's assistants exchanged glances, careful not to make any noise. No one spoke unnecessarily. Ninel remained at her spot by the wall, shivering slightly as the cold seemed to intensify. Her gaze alternated between the passage leading underground and the center of the enchantment where her blood had been placed. Minutes stretched on in agonizing silence. Then Ninel noticed a shimmering in the air above the ritual marks, as though heat waves were rising from an invisible flame. Hayden immediately signaled his assistants, who took their positions near the metal rods, their attention fixed on the center. A low, resonant sound broke the quiet, a deep growl that didn't come from the bell or the wind. It resembled a muffled roar from deep below. Ninel flinched, realizing that the ritual was reacting to the presence of the werewolf. She thought perhaps Prue was already approaching. The sound came again, louder and more strained, almost like a pained moan. Hayden grabbed a long dagger from the prepared table. Its blade gleamed, and Ninel realized it was coated with something special. Perhaps silver or an alloy designed to harm werewolves. Hayden's composure remained intact, as if he'd faced such situations countless times before. He motioned for one of his assistants to step forward with a torch. The assistant advanced a few steps, illuminating the area. In the center of the pattern, the shimmering grew more intense, as though something unseen was forcing its way into the trap from another realm. The burning herbs continued to smolder, their smoke spreading through the air. Seconds later, a piercing, almost animalistic growl echoed from the darkness surrounding the underground passage. It reverberated through the abandoned halls. Out of the corner of her eye, Ninel saw something pale flash deep within the corridor, a shadow darting across the gloom. She strained to see, trying not to distract Hayden. The thick darkness spilling into the entrance obscured the view, but the rustling grew louder, and for a brief moment, Ninel caught a glimpse of movement, a limb or a hand with elongated claws. The shadow swayed and vanished, as though the creature were still debating whether to emerge. One of Hayden's assistants hesitated, stepping back slightly, sensing the unease. But Hayden waved him forward with a subtle gesture, signaling him to hold his ground. The assistant nodded, gripping the torch tightly. Ninel took a deep breath, bracing herself for the confrontation with the frenzied werewolf that had once been the protector of her family. She recalled how, just a year ago, Prue had seemed ready to kneel at her feet if the old Master Xavier commanded it. She remembered how no one had ever doubted Prue's loyalty, and now he had become their greatest threat. Another growl echoed, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. From the corridor, a figure emerged into the edge of the trap, a creature resembling a wolf standing on its hind legs. The upper part of the creature still bore faint human features, but its body was covered in thick, dark fur. Ninel immediately recognized Prue, even though his face had twisted into something unrecognizable. He froze for a moment, staring at the smoking center of the hall, drawn by the scent of her blood. His eyes glowed with a reddish light, filled with deadly menace, yet mixed with an inexplicable desire to draw closer. It was as if he was at war with himself, torn between the pull of familial blood and the fury he felt after her perceived betrayal. Hayden seized the moment. He signaled to his assistants, who simultaneously struck their metal rods against the concrete floor, activating hidden seals. The air suddenly vibrated, and a faint arc appeared around Prue, flickering before solidifying into a transparent barrier. The werewolf shifted his shoulders and tried to step forward, but his movement was met with resistance. He let out a louder growl, muscles taut, as he struck the invisible wall with his clawed hand. The spot where he hit shimmered briefly, as if meeting something solid. Prue leaped sideways, still not understanding he was trapped. Hayden, dagger in hand, took a step forward but kept his distance. He waited patiently for the barrier's energy to stabilize. His assistants moved closer to the center, pouring a thin line of liquid onto the floor that reeked of bitterness and burning. Ninel clenched her fists as Prue noticed their movements and let out a menacing snarl. The werewolf clawed at the empty space of the barrier, trying to tear through it with sheer brute strength. Hayden murmured a few phrases under his breath, as if calculating or invoking something. He didn't ask Ninel to intervene, knowing her role was complete. She had given her blood, helped create the trap, and lured Prue here. Now all that remained was to see it through. At that moment, Prue froze in an unnatural pose, as though feeling an invisible force pressing down on him. The fur on his shoulders bristled and he roared, muscles straining against the weight bearing him down. To Hayden, this was the signal he had been waiting for. Dagger poised, he lunged toward the trap, ready to act. His assistants followed, and the scene became a chaotic struggle for the fate of Prue, the Xavier family, and even Hayden himself. Ninel watched as the barrier wavered, Prue's defiance growing stronger. She had a fleeting sense that he might break free at any moment. But the ritual wasn't over, and Hayden clearly hadn't planned for an easy ending. The silence of the abandoned warehouse was shattered by the clash of metal and piercing growls, turning the confrontation into a cacophony that drowned out all thought. The clanging of metal echoed like the distant hum of old machinery. Prue, confined within the invisible field, bared his teeth, which had long since lost their human shape. He attempted to retreat, but was met with the unyielding wall of the barrier. Hayden held his dagger at the ready, waiting for the right moment to strike. His assistants, stationed around the perimeter, didn't rush forward, but instead prepared small talismans hanging from cords at their waists. Their role was to maintain the integrity of the magical circle while Hayden executed the final step. Ninel remained at a distance, careful not to distract the mage. She watched as Prue thrashed within the confines of the trap, his movements growing increasingly erratic. His muscles rippled, his fur bristled, and his claws raked the air, sparking against the invisible barrier. At one point, the werewolf turned his head toward Ninel. She felt an almost palpable wave of emotion, as if he were trying to communicate something unspoken. Perhaps he recognized her as his mistress, but mistrust and blind rage had overpowered his former loyalty. Hayden stepped closer to the center. The floor beneath him was treated with a dark substance, and in the light of the solitary lantern, the curved lines of symbols glistened faintly. Raising his left hand, Hayden held a short rod made of a rare alloy, its sharp tip emitting a pale glow. Prue stiffened, sensing the magical pulse, and lunged forward. The barrier held, though cracks like glowing fissures appeared in several places. Hayden whispered something, touching the rod to his palm before tracing an arc in the air, as if drawing another layer of the trap around the werewolf. The assistants reacted immediately, reinforcing the spell. Two of them knelt to press talismans against the floor, while the third opened a small vial and poured its contents along the edge of the encircled trap. The liquid sizzled as it hit the ground, releasing a sharp, acrid smoke that made one of the assistants cough. Prue hissed and recoiled a step, his eyes burning with grim determination. He now seemed fully transformed into a beast, stripped of human speech and reason. His movements became jagged and angular. His breathing labored and uneven like a predator pushed to its limits. Moments later, he lashed out again, his claws slamming into the barrier as though rebelling against his inevitable fate. Hayden reached into his belt and retrieved a small pouch. Tapping it, he produced a faint clinking sound from the objects inside. He handed the pouch to one of his assistants, who poured several long needles into his palm. Each needle bore symbols barely visible beneath a coat of dull lacquer. A moment later, the assistant pressed the needles into the edges of the circle, as if embedding them in solid glass. Tiny sparks erupted at each point of contact. Around the werewolf, a faint glowing web began to form, its threads pulsing rhythmically. Prue threw his head back, releasing a guttural howl that conveyed pain and helplessness. To Hayden, this was the sign to proceed with the final stage. He raised the dagger above his head and gestured for his assistants to retreat. They immediately stepped beyond the floor's marked patterns, clearing a direct path between Hayden and the trapped werewolf. With a fiery intensity now burning in his eyes, Hayden surged forward, covering the remaining distance in just a few strides. The blade gleamed as he struck, and in that instant, Prue lunged, attempting to intercept his attacker's arm. Their clash was brief but thunderous. The barrier held Prue in place, preventing him from retreating, and Hayden used this to drive the blade below the werewolf's ribs. A guttural snarl erupted from Prue as he swung a clawed arm wildly, but Hayden evaded the strike, sliding deftly along the floor. From the corner of her eye, Ninel saw two assistants rush forward, but Hayden waved them off, determined to act alone. Adjusting his grip on the dagger, he aimed carefully and delivered another strike, this time aiming for the heart. Prue moved faster, deflecting the blade with a swipe of his arm. The metallic clang echoed as the dagger glanced off the werewolf's toughened hide, but Hayden didn't relent. Feinting left, he followed with a third thrust, finally driving the blade between Prue's ribs. The werewolf let out an anguished howl, his body jerking before collapsing as if an internal spring had snapped. A sharp odor filled the air, a mix of oxidized metal and aged fur. Ninel watched as the werewolf stilled, and the strain of Hayden's effort was evident on his face. His hand trembled slightly, the dagger still embedded in Prue's body. For a moment it seemed as if the beast in its final throes might deliver a last deadly strike. Prue's clawed hand rose, its talons mere inches from Hayden's throat, but the werewolf's strength failed. Hayden pulled the dagger free and Prue collapsed to his knees. His fur began to recede in patches, melting back into his skin as though the transformation were reversing. A series of cracks like splintering bones filled the air. Prue wheezed, swayed, and his limbs twisted into unnatural shapes. Hayden's assistants moved toward the body, but the mage raised a hand, commanding them to stop. With a swift motion, Hayden drew a short, knotted cord from beneath his cloak and deftly wrapped it around Prue's neck, securing it tightly before the werewolf could lose consciousness entirely. Then, in a deliberate act, Hayden ran the dagger across his own wrist, letting a few drops of crimson blood fall onto the creature's fur. In response, the symbols etched around the trap flared with cold flames that erupted into jagged bursts of ominous light. Prue shuddered, lurched forward, and fell heavily to his side. His body stilled, the air seeming to exhale with the final beat of his heart. The barrier surrounding him wavered, trembling with an eerie ripple before fading entirely. Hayden remained standing over the lifeless body, breathing heavily as though he had endured countless rounds of battle. The dagger in his hand glimmered faintly, retaining the residual glow of the enchanted blood it had pierced. Ninel took 2 cautious steps forward, her mind grappling with the realization that it was over. She stared at Prue, the werewolf who had been cursed from birth with the burden of serving as the family's protector. That duty had defined his entire existence, and now it had stripped him of his last shred of humanity. Hayden, wiping the blood from his blade with a scrap of fabric, glanced up at Ninel as though expecting her acknowledgement. She found herself at a loss for words, struggling to maintain composure in the face of Prue's lifeless body sprawled across the concrete floor. Once, he had stood as her guardian, protecting her quarters. Now he was reduced to a lifeless shell. The mage approached her silently, sheathing his dagger, and gestured toward the remnants of the ritual's symbols. His assistants, understanding the unspoken command, began dismantling the setup. They removed the metal rods that had formed the trap and scattered a handful of coarse salt crystals onto the cement. The white granules absorbed the bloodstains, stripping the site of any lingering magic. A tense silence descended, broken only by the crunch of boots against crumbling debris. Hayden straightened, his exhaustion barely concealed, and issued orders to his assistants to wrap the body in a tarp. He understood that the ritual remained incomplete, as family guardians like Prue often bore additional layers of protective spells. However, the primary threat had been neutralized. Ninel watched as Hayden's assistants bundled Prue's lifeless body into a rough canvas sack. Hayden retrieved a small pouch from his pocket, pouring out a fine powder she assumed was meant to neutralize the magical residue in the area. This was the standard method for dealing with enchanted servants after their destruction, a necessary precaution to prevent any remnants of their magic from reanimating them. She felt a pang of bitterness, though she knew she had made the right choice. The Xavier family needed protection, and there had been no other way. Now, everything depended on the terms Hayden would demand for his service. His grim expression suggested the cost would be far from symbolic. His methods had required rare and dangerous power, and such magic left scars, even on its wielder. She stood in silence, watching Hayden complete the ritual and observing his assistants tighten the cords around the tarp. Despite the brutality of the operation, Ninel felt a hollow sense of relief. The danger was gone, and Prue could no longer threaten the city or the family. But she knew the price for this victory would be steep. In the now empty warehouse, only the unsightly bundle wrapped in canvas remained, marking the end of Prue's life. The air smelled of damp concrete, overheated metal, and the bitterness of the herbs burned at the start of the ritual. A dim lantern flickered weakly, casting light on the blood-stained floor and the faint silver glow of the remaining symbols. Ninel stood straight, trying to maintain her composure. The Xavier family's guards lingered nearby but kept their distance. Some had witnessed parts of the fight, others had only heard the sounds of the struggle. None dared intervene. It was a matter of the family's ancient magic and the dark arts Hayden had brought to bear. Hayden exhaled deeply, running a hand across his face as if to wipe away invisible fatigue. He appeared composed, but Ninel could see the tension in his shoulders and the slight unfocus in his gaze, as though he hadn't fully emerged from the trance of magical combat. Beside him stood one of his assistants, a stocky man with coarse hair tied into a tight knot. He shifted uneasily, waiting for further instructions or perhaps permission to begin clearing the site. Hayden nodded curtly, and his team began gathering the shattered metal fragments, burnt rods, and scorched stains. Their task was to erase the evidence of the ritual and suppress any residual magical traces, ensuring the city's curious onlookers would find nothing out of place. Ninel's eyes drifted to the tarp-wrapped bundle that held what remained of Prue. She recalled the first time she had seen him beside the late Lord Xavier. Back then, Prue had been in his human form, tidy, with a short haircut and an old-fashioned jacket that emphasized his sturdy frame. No one would have suspected the beast lurking within. The family seal, bonded by magic, had made Prue a reliable servant, someone they could trust implicitly. But over the years, his loyalty had fractured, his mind splintered. Ninel shuddered realizing that she had always feared Prue's betrayal, but never imagined it would manifest so terrifyingly. In a subdued tone, Hayden instructed 2 of his men to carry the bundle to the waiting car outside the gates. Ninel understood he wouldn't leave the body behind. He likely intended to dispose of it in a way that would ensure Prue could not be revived, whether by accident or malicious intent. Deep down, she was relieved that this responsibility would not fall on her or her household. The Xavier family had already endured enough losses and covert expenses to also contend with the grim rituals of disposal. All that remained was to ensure Hayden followed through on his end of the bargain. She took a few cautious steps toward Hayden, who stood leaning against a pile of broken boards. His expression was a mix of weariness and focused contemplation. He looked at Ninel intently without speaking. She sensed he was gauging her reaction, waiting to see if she would break the silence first. The moment stretched on, and Ninel began to worry that the mage would demand payment immediately or name terms that would shock her. Yet Hayden showed no urgency, as though carefully considering his next move. Hayden let his gaze drift across the ruins before it landed briefly on the blood-streaked floor. He spoke with a tone so casual it bordered on indifference, remarking that while the ritual was mostly complete, residual magic still lingered. He explained that by midnight the active components of the scheme would stabilize, ceasing to emit the energy that had drawn the werewolf. Ninel understood that her blood, mixed with the substances used in the ritual, had been the binding element of the trap. Now that Prue was destroyed, the connection had severed, but echoes of its power would persist until the magical design fully dissipated. Hayden assured her that by morning there would be no trace left, provided his assistants completed their tasks correctly. Her role, he added, was finished. The priority now was to exit the industrial zone discreetly, avoiding any undue attention. Ninel listened, her thoughts drifting to how she had approached this mission the day before, imagining it would be a simple matter of setting a trap and swiftly eliminating the threat. Instead, it had unfolded into a protracted ritual, a brutal confrontation, and the grim spectacle of Prue's death. Relief eluded her. Perhaps her mind had not yet fully grasped that the danger was gone, or perhaps the weight of the losses overshadowed any sense of victory. Standing beside Hayden now, everything felt transactional, like a deal in which neither side emerged truly satisfied. She suspected Hayden had deeper motives, ones he had yet to reveal. While Hayden's assistants packed up their tools, Ninel made her way to the exit of the warehouse, where her guards waited in silence, exchanging glances as if anticipating instructions. She gave a curt command, assuring them that the plan was on track, and instructed them to load the equipment brought by her household into the car. She also directed them to dispose of the empty crates left at the back of the hangar. The guards needed no further confirmation that the hunt was over. They had seen the tarped body, and knew that no other creature could have roared and thrashed like the wounded beast they had heard. The eerie silence that followed the battle weighed heavily, filling the air with an unshakable sense of finality. When everything was ready, Ninel turned to Hayden and noticed his appraising gaze. She knew this moment was pivotal. Though he hadn't mentioned payment explicitly, there was an unspoken understanding that services of this kind came at a high price. Hayden carefully stowed the last of his ritual implements into a specialized case, which his assistants carried outside to load into their vehicle. Ninel hesitated before quietly suggesting that Hayden return to the mansion with her. It would be easier to discuss terms in privacy and plan the next steps. Hayden nodded seriously, agreeing, but stated that he first needed to send his men out of town with Prue's body to ensure its complete destruction. Ninelle offered no objection. She realized the rest of the night would be chaotic. There would be tracks to cover, and any questions from local police or city officials would need to be managed delicately. Despite her deep exhaustion, she forced herself to remain composed, suppressing the visible tremors of the toll the night had taken on her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, responsibilities she would need to face with the same resilience she had cultivated as the wife of the late Lord Xavier. Hayden gave the final orders to his team. Soon the vehicles departed, one carrying the tarped body, and the other loaded with equipment and several men tasked with erasing the ritual's traces from the warehouse. Ninelle remained with her 2 guards and the mage, who now seemed like more than just a hired hand. His black clothing was dusted with grime, and a stitched seam on his coat pocket hinted at a past tear, carefully mended. Ninelle noticed this detail, realizing that the man before her, despite his enigmatic aura, was as grounded as anyone else, someone who took risks and bore scars. They stepped outside, where the cool air greeted them sharply. The sky over the industrial zone had begun to lighten, though dawn was still some time away. In the distance, a decaying smokestack loomed with rows of abandoned storage units stretching beyond it, untouched for decades. Time in this corner of the city seemed frozen in another era. A thin crescent moon hung low over the rooftops, marking the boundary between the night's stillness and the approaching morning. Ninelle glanced at Hayden as he rolled his shoulders, working out the stiffness from the night's exertions. She suspected that both of them wanted to forget what had transpired in the warehouse, if only for a moment. But that was impossible. She ordered her guards to start the car and approach the driver, instructing him to return to the mansion quickly but quietly. Hayden joined her in the back seat, gazing out the window as they passed leaning fences and overgrown lots. The silence between them grew tense, yet oddly serene, as if they had shared the burdens of the night and now waited to see who would break the quiet first. Ninelle's thoughts wandered to the mansion they were returning to, a place still marked by Prue's presence, though he would never again cross its thresholds. The uneasy sense of liberation kept her from closing her eyes, and she gripped the armrest lightly, steadying her breathing. Hayden sat upright, his hands resting on his knees, his face devoid of expression. The car navigated the darkened streets carefully. Ahead lay a long conversation about what the Xavier family would do next, and how Hayden intended to collect his due. They arrived at the mansion deep into the night, the city still slumbering but already bidding farewell to the darkness. The car stopped at a side entrance, bypassing the grand driveway, and servants quickly opened the heavy doors. The corridors were lit dimly, their muted glow preserving the quiet of the household. Guards escorted Ninelle and Hayden to a secluded part of the mansion reserved for rare overnight guests. Such caution was prudent. Their discussion needed to take place far from prying ears. A few servants placed hot tea on the table and promptly withdrew, asking no questions. It was clear to all that the events of the night had shifted the family's course, leaving Ninelle to navigate the changes. She gestured for Hayden to sit on an antique sofa with a carved wooden back and dark green upholstery. He accepted the invitation without hesitation. Ninelle took the armchair across from him, crossing her legs as she maintained an air of calm. Her face was pale, shadows under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. Yet her voice remained steady as she quietly, almost in a whisper, asked if everything with Prue's body had been handled. Hayden assured her that his men had already reached the designated site outside the city and begun the final disposal. There would be no chance for the werewolf to return, not by accident, nor through any malicious intent. Ninelle nodded, taking in his words. She didn't say thank you, but her eyes conveyed her acknowledgement of the operation's complexity. She was about to broach the topic of payment, but Hayden spoke first. Hayden wasted no time, directly asking what Ninel was willing to offer as compensation. He reminded her that dealing with a family servant of this nature wasn't simply about physical destruction, but about eradicating the magic that sustained such a being. These tasks, he explained in a dry, matter-of-fact tone, demanded not just time but tremendous reserves of energy. He spoke without embellishment, like a man accustomed to dangerous transactions who understood their worth precisely. Ninel listened intently, her gaze alternating between the floor and his piercing eyes. She realized that Hayden had already guessed her broader ambitions, namely, that the Xavier family had long-term plans, and the young mistress wouldn't be able to maintain her hold over the city alone. A brief silence followed before Ninel offered her response. She proposed support, influence, and access to the unique artifacts stored in the hidden chambers of the Xavier Mansion. In addition to traditional payment in money and valuable items, she mentioned something far more significant: a formal alliance, contingent on mutual agreement. Her voice steady, she suggested that a marriage or similar formal bond could grant Hayden the authority to share in the Xavier family's power. This would provide him with access to prestigious circles, seats on city councils, and ancient relics that even she had not yet fully explored. Hayden's expression remained impassive, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He clearly understood that such offers were rarely made without hidden strings. Still, it was no coincidence that he had returned to Canamela at a time when the widow of the old lord was searching for someone to rely on. While he wasn't certain he needed a formal connection to a family steeped in dark secrets, the potential benefits were worth exploring. He asked what guarantees Ninel could offer, unwilling to enter into a fleeting agreement that might later unravel into broken promises. Setting her teacup aside, Ninel assured him that the marriage would be legally binding, with all necessary documents authenticated by local notaries and sealed with the family's crest. She added that the scrolls left by previous generations contained several magical formulas designed to solidify such a union between an outsider and a member of the Xavier line. These rituals had been used sparingly, typically in times when uniting resources from different branches of the family was essential. With the family now nearly depleted, Ninel saw an opportunity to rebuild its strength through an experienced ally. From a perspective of prestige and power, she believed Hayden would find the arrangement advantageous. Hayden listened without giving any clear indication of agreement or refusal. He understood that Ninel wasn't merely offering a deal. She was staking the future of her family and herself on this proposition. Yet he also knew her to be cautious, always leaving herself a way out. He pressed further, asking if the ritual she mentioned carried any hidden conditions, such as vows that might bind parts of his soul to the family's will. Hayden was acutely aware that ancient magical oaths only held power when their secret terms were upheld. Ninel inclined her head slightly, admitting that similar rituals had been used in the creation of family-bound servants like Prue. However, she assured him that this was not about turning him into a submissive werewolf. Her words seemed calculated to ease his suspicions, framing the proposal as a partnership for governing the city and safeguarding the young heir to the late Lord Xavier, who was too young to assume his rightful position. The conversation unfolded slowly, like a strategic game in which both participants fortified their positions. Hayden was already aware of the dangers inherent in such ancient rites, especially when one party sought to deceive the other. Yet the prospect of gaining formal authority through a marriage to Ninel stoked his ambitions. He listened as she detailed the wealth, influence, and support he would receive should he agree to the union. Then suddenly, he asked why she had chosen him over more loyal confidants. Ninel replied that her trust in others was limited, and that Hayden had demonstrated a willingness to employ forbidden methods to achieve his goals. She also emphasized that while he was an outsider, he understood Cainamela better than anyone else. As dawn began to creep through the windows, Ninel offered Hayden a chance to rest. He accepted, recognizing that leaving immediately after such an intense ritual could invite unforeseen repercussions if he didn't allow time to recover and dissipate residual magical tension. Ninel instructed her servants to escort him to the guest quarters, provide fresh clothing, and prepare hot water. As Hayden rose to leave, she asked if he needed a physician. He declined, noting that his injuries were minor and that rest would suffice. Once Hayden had left, Ninel remained seated, staring at the sliver of the waning moon visible through the window. The servants dimmed the lamps and the corridors grew quieter. Her mind churned with thoughts of how to maneuver skillfully, on one hand to draw Hayden into the family's rituals, and on the other to ensure she retained control. She had revealed her intentions to no one. The rituals that created family-bound werewolves had multiple tiers. One of those formulas could be activated during a marital pact, provided the other party unknowingly uttered the requisite phrases. Ninel smiled faintly, her reflection in the window reminding her of the girl she had once been, a quiet orphan taking her first steps into the family's secrets, already adept at hiding her true intentions. Now she held a trump card, the legal right to invite Hayden into the family, envelop him in care, and, eventually, reveal that his advantageous alliance had ensnared him in the magical bonds of the Xavier lineage. He might sense something amiss, but by then it would be too late. Ninel resolved not to disclose the ritual's hidden layers just yet. Let events unfold naturally, she decided, until the moment came for Hayden to discover the stirrings of bestial instincts within himself. In the northern wing of the Xavier mansion, an air of cautious stillness prevailed. The ritual Hayden had studied for hours seemed excessively intricate, layered with complexities and, most importantly, latent threats. Ninel had watched his reactions with careful restraint as though testing whether he would falter at the last moment. The servants in the corridors whispered softly, mindful not to disturb the mage resting in the guest quarters. Hayden spent most of the morning in quiet reflection, replaying Ninel's arguments in his mind. His thoughts often drifted back to Prue, who had once been an ordinary man before being transformed into a werewolf by the family's ancient magic. Too many coincidences suggested that the ceremony Ninel proposed carried the same seeds of darkness, albeit cloaked in a different guise. Hayden understood that if a trap existed, it would be expertly concealed. Lady Xavier was no naive heiress. In the early afternoon, a servant knocked softly on his door, asking for permission to enter. Hayden allowed it, and a short man entered, carrying a tray with a meal. He placed the dishes on the table, muttered an apology for disturbing him, and prepared to leave. But Hayden, in a calm tone, asked a quiet question. Had the servant heard anything about the rituals used in the creation of Prue? The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the subject. After a moment of nervous silence, he replied that he hadn't seen anything himself but had heard from others that not all family members participated in Prue's creation, which might have introduced unwanted flaws. Hayden thanked him curtly and dismissed him. Left alone, Hayden picked at his meal without appetite, his thoughts dwelling on the roots of the Xavier family's magic. The scroll Ninel had shown him contained notes on awakening powers through the blood of two people, granting the family new protectors. While it didn't explicitly state that the result would be a werewolf, the text was riddled with ambiguities. Hayden suspected that Ninel might already have prepared unique components to enable a covert transformation. He recalled how Prue's eyes had clouded in his final months, and wondered if something similar might happen to him. As the day waned, Ninel invited Hayden to a small sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth, its light reflecting off polished wood paneling. She sat in an armchair, waiting for him to take the seat across from her. The room was empty of servants, save for the soft crackle of firewood and the faint whistle of warm air rising through the chimney. Ninel informed him directly that she had notified a few key individuals about a preliminary ceremony to take place the next day, with the formal marriage to be finalized later, pending council approval. Hayden nodded, careful not to betray his unease. She added that before retiring for the night, he should review the ritual scroll to memorize the vows. Hayden promised he would be ready by morning. The conversation remained composed, devoid of sharp tones, yet Hayden detected a shadow of triumph in Ninel's voice, as if she already knew resistance was futile. Returning to his quarters, he opened the scroll and read the ritual lines with excruciating attention. Certain phrases allowed for the expansion of the bond beyond a simple oath. If even one participant secretly uttered specific words, the agreement's nature could shift dramatically. Hayden realized he had no way to ensure that Ninel wouldn't insert these secret words during the ceremony. She was presenting the ritual as a marriage pact, cloaking her deeper intentions. His gaze fell on his protective amulets, which he planned to conceal in his sleeves. He hoped they might dampen any magical effects should the need arise. The night passed uneasily. Hayden lay awake, counting the clock's chimes echoing through the mansion. By morning, the household was abuzz with activity. Servants scurried about, preparing the ceremony space where a few senior relatives and trusted witnesses would gather. Ninel remained out of sight, but news of her detailed preparations permeated the air. Dressed in a black formal suit, Hayden tucked 2 small protective crystals into a hidden pocket on his belt, regarding them as a thin layer of insurance. By midday, a servant escorted him to the ceremony hall, where the scent of old incense and wax candles lingered. The hall was modest, its walls nearly bare save for a few portraits near the entrance. At the center stood a table draped in white cloth, upon which lay a dagger with a wolf's head engraved on its hilt and a ceramic bowl beside it. Hayden immediately fixated on the bowl. It was undoubtedly intended for blood. Ninel entered moments later, dressed in an understated yet formal gown that signified the gravity of the occasion. She gestured toward the dagger and explained that the ceremony would begin with a recognition ritual, where both bride and groom must declare their willingness to unite. 2 elderly relatives, women with sharp gazes, took seats against the wall, while several servants lingered nearby. One held a scroll, though the text appeared abbreviated. Clearly, the full ritual was not meant for everyone's eyes. Hayden voiced no objections, recognizing the inevitability of secrecy but remaining internally on edge. The ceremony began with a brief formal exchange. Ninel expressed her consent and kissed the dagger at the hilt. Hayden followed suit, feeling the cold metal against his lips. Then, per instruction, he recited a few lines that sounded like a vow to protect the family and share power in Canamella. As he spoke, a servant pricked Ninel's finger, letting a drop of her blood fall into the bowl. The process seemed almost harmless. When it was Hayden's turn, he exhaled deeply, rolled up his sleeve, and made a small cut on his forearm, allowing a single drop of blood to join hers. The mixture swirled, and one of the senior relatives murmured something under their breath. Ninel bowed her head slightly, appearing pleased with the proceedings. Hayden noticed the lamps in the hall flicker, their flames briefly surging higher. He immediately recognized the activation of blood magic. Retreating now would be seen as a betrayal, and both Ninel and her attendants would likely turn on him. He clenched his teeth, determined to endure. According to the ritual, the bowl's contents were to be symbolically consumed to seal the union. As the bowl was raised to his face, Hayden caught a bitter scent, distinct from ordinary blood. Ninel must have added something else. Watching him closely, Ninel's expression betrayed no doubt. She was intent on ensuring he drank. Her calm but vigilant demeanor left Hayden no illusions. Refusal would bring swift retribution. Slowly, he lifted the bowl to his lips. As the liquid touched his tongue, the room seemed to contract around him. A faint sheen of sweat broke on his forehead, and the sound of muffled whispers filled his ears. A guest across the room glanced in his direction, as if sensing an impending shift. Hayden swallowed. The substance slid down his throat, leaving an unpleasant, viscous aftertaste laced with foreign energy. He tensed, activating the hidden talisman in his pocket, but the enchanted liquid had already begun its work. Ninel's eyes briefly gleamed with an unspoken triumph. The final words of the ceremony were spoken like commands, formally sealing the union. Hayden caught the phrase recorded in the family ledger before everything blurred. The portraits on the walls seemed to shift, their painted faces twisting into mocking expressions. Weakness swept through him, something alien stirring in his chest. Stumbling forward, he managed 2 unsteady steps before collapsing to his knees. No one moved to help him. Ninel stood silently, her gaze cold and unyielding, yet tinged with an almost affectionate regret. The servants remained frozen, understanding that the mage had fallen into their mistress's trap. Hayden's vision darkened, and the sound of a distant, resonant roar echoed within his mind. Hayden could feel the pulsing in his ears as his body lost its connection to familiar reality. Something twisted inside him, as if an alien force was carving its path through him. He knelt before the table where the ominous chalice still rested, and he saw the glint of anticipation and triumph in Ninel's eyes. None of those present dared move closer, as though afraid that the magic raging within Hayden might spill over uncontrollably. The servants held their breath, while a pair of elderly relatives pressed handkerchiefs to their faces, watching the agonizing transformation that could no longer be stopped. Ninel, maintaining an air of composure, stepped back cautiously, careful not to enter the area of volatile magical surges. She had meticulously orchestrated the conditions, merging the ancient marital oath ritual with a secret formula that had once created Prue, a werewolf. One critical ingredient, the remnants of Prue's tail, she had hidden among the powders she mixed with blood and poured into the chalice shortly before the ceremony. This subtle addition gave the magical mechanism its intended direction. She knew Hayden might suspect something was amiss, but she counted on his pride and hunger for power. She had not miscalculated. Unwilling to miss his chance, he had stayed, refusing to back down. Now that the liquid had entered his body, it was too late to fight back. With a convulsive jerk, Hayden gripped the edge of the table, struggling to rise. His face contorted, the veins in his neck bulging prominently. His breathing turned to ragged gasps. It was as though he was wrestling with some unseen presence. A constricting itch coiled in his chest, as if a wild, foreign will was awakening beneath his ribs. A glance at his hands was enough to see the changes. His nails had elongated slightly, and his skin had begun to shift, not yet sprouting animalistic fur, but clearly no longer entirely human. However, the process was anything but smooth. Unlike Prue, whose creation had been carefully overseen by the late Lord Xavier, Hayden already possessed internal magical conditioning, which resisted the foreign force being grafted into him. As a result, the transformation came in fits and starts. Ninel ordered everyone not to interfere, though the apprehension on some faces was unmistakable, as if they feared an outbreak of uncontrollable aggression. One of the elder relatives cleared his throat nervously, reminding everyone that the ritual had to be completed. Ninel approached Hayden as closely as she dared, looking down at the man who had so recently dictated terms to her. In a low voice, meant for no one's ears but his, she murmured her regret for having to resort to such measures. But she had no other choice if she was to preserve power within the family. Her late husband, Lord Xavier, had made the mistake of granting Prue autonomy. Now, by creating a new werewolf, she intended to ensure this one would serve only her will. Hayden lifted his face, strained with confusion and fury. His trembling hand fumbled for the amulets hidden beneath his clothing, but his fingers were unsteady and uncooperative. Magical resonators might have softened the effects, but the poison had already sunk too deep, and the formulas etched in the secret scrolls proved stronger than personal charms. Ninel signaled to her servants, and two of them moved to the far side of the hall, opening a massive chest brought earlier from the archives. From within they retrieved a small vial adorned with intricate silver patterns. Inside, a crimson-brown essence shimmered faintly. It was Prue's heart, preserved in a special state. Its magical energy, sealed within the vial, could further suppress any attempts by Hayden to reclaim his human form. One of the servants handed the vial to Ninel, and she discreetly let a few drops spill onto the rim of the chalice. The remaining mixture began to gleam with a faint, otherworldly light. Now the ritual took on an additional potency. Hayden's body was not only succumbing to the curse born of the marital pact, but also to the lingering power that once belonged to Prue. This ensured the new werewolf Ninel sought to create would be even stronger than its predecessor, though far less stable. Ninel was prepared for this. She needed a fearsome but completely obedient beast to solidify her status and protect her family from any external threats. Hayden felt a feral growl rising in his mind. He let out a hoarse sound, forcing himself upright, leaning heavily on the table. His gaze caught the dagger lying beside the chalice. In a desperate lunge, he seized the weapon. It was clear he intended to strike at Ninel or at least cut her to disrupt the ritual. But his muscles convulsed, and crimson flashes clouded his vision. He staggered toward her, blade raised but faltered. In that instant, one of the guards stepped in, swiftly and silently, striking the dagger from his grasp with a single blow. Hayden, losing his balance, fell to his knees once more. The servants, relatives, and Ninel herself formed a loose circle, as though expecting the mage to break free and unleash havoc. The air in the hall grew heavier. Waves of pulsating energy rippled outward, causing the candle flames to flicker erratically. Hayden struggled to breathe, his skin darkening as if an alien texture was emerging beneath it. His teeth were elongating, though the process remained uneven. The magical barrier within him had not yet fully yielded, but the beastly essence was advancing relentlessly. He tried to shout something, but only a strangled growl escaped his throat. Ninel ordered the guards to stay alert. She withdrew behind two of her servants but continued observing the transformation with calm resolve. Her face betrayed a satisfied understanding that everything was proceeding as planned. The act binding Hayden to the Xavier family was nearing completion. Stripping him of his will was the most effective way to compel a powerful mage to serve unconditionally. She recalled how clever Hayden had been, meticulously studying every ritual and crafting strategies for his own gain. Now he writhed in agony, losing his human voice, replaced by primal reflexes. The ancient Xavier line was willing to make substantial sacrifices for such a terrifyingly potent tool. The moment of final transformation came abruptly. Hayden arched backward, his head snapping up as a wolf-like howl tore from his throat. The fabric across his back shredded, revealing tufts of dark fur. Simultaneously, his nails blackened, morphing into curved claws. His sharpened fangs clamped together, and his eyes burned red, stripped of any human expression. Those around him recoiled in unison, unwilling to risk proximity. The raw, animalistic power radiating from him compelled even the bravest to hesitate, fearing he might lash out in a frenzy. But Ninel had anticipated this phase. The heart of Prue, or rather its residual magical energy mixed with blood, tethered the new beast to her will like an unbreakable chain. Hayden roared, rising onto his limbs, but did not attack. Every muscle in his body seemed ready to explode into violence, yet an internal struggle held him back. Ninel signaled her guards to slowly close in, testing whether the mage werewolf would remain under control. Hayden, or the thing he had become, glared around the room, radiating rage that had no outlet. Darkness clawed at his mind, tangling pain, defiance, and helplessness. A flicker of intelligence gleamed in his eyes, but the beastly nature had already taken dominance. Ninel approached cautiously, stopping a few paces away. Looking down at the creature she had created, she spoke a short command, one inscribed in the scrolls, words granting the master the right to dictate the werewolf's actions. The beast growled but did not charge. The ritual had granted Ninel absolute authority, and Hayden felt as if iron shackles had locked onto his soul. For a fleeting moment he raised his eyes, filled with terror, but he could no longer speak. Ninel, cold satisfaction etched on her face, regarded her new familial servant, forged through deception. She thought briefly that this scheme had worked even better than it had with Prue. Perhaps now she controlled not just a werewolf, but a mage werewolf capable of carrying out her every command. She understood it would take time for the creature to sever its final connection to human consciousness, but she was confident it would soon be ready for its first order. Footsteps echoed in the corridor as other servants hurried to report that visitors had arrived in the courtyard. To Lady Xavier, this was of no consequence. She now had a new instrument of power, and no external guests could intimidate her. The gathered crowd cautiously retreated to the walls, leaving an open space between Ninel and the werewolf. She already envisioned the full extent of her triumph. The ancient Xavier lineage now possessed a weapon capable of crushing any foe with a single leap. Whether Hayden retained even a sliver of will was irrelevant. Escape was impossible. As the ceremony concluded, Ninel held out the chalice, where a few drops of the enchanted liquid remained, and at last he drank.